It began with whispers in the darkness, messages passed on scraps of paper, secret meetings behind closed doors, and the quiet defiance of people who refused to accept that their lives were already written by others. In the ghettos of Nazi-occupied Europe, survival was never guaranteed, but neither was submission. From the moment the Nazis imposed their cruel laws, deportations, and forced labor, Jews began to fight in the only way they could, by resisting. At first, these acts were small, almost invisible, yet they marked the beginning of one of the most extraordinary stories of courage in human history. People who were labeled by a brutal regime as powerless and expendable proved that resistance could take many forms, that even in the face of overwhelming oppression, the human spirit could refuse to be broken. The origins of Jewish resistance were rooted in the ghettos themselves, crowded enclosures where entire communities were forced to live under starvation, disease, and constant surveillance. Warsaw, Lodz, Vilnius, and hundreds of other towns became centers of fear, but also of quiet determination. From the earliest days of occupation, underground networks began to form. Teachers, students, clerks, and religious leaders, ordinary people, started organizing secret classes for children, printing newspapers in hidden rooms, and preserving religious and cultural practices despite the danger. These were not mere diversions, they were acts of defiance that said, "We exist, and we will continue to exist, even if you try to erase us." Every forbidden word, every smuggled lesson, every clandestine meeting was a refusal to let the Nazis define their humanity. Smuggling was one of the first and most essential forms of resistance. Young men and women risked their lives carrying food, medicine, and messages in and out of the ghettos. They learned to navigate the streets under the constant gaze of armed patrols, slipping through cracks in walls, hiding in cellars, and using disguise whenever possible. Smuggling was dangerous. Capture often meant immediate execution, but it became a lifeline, not just physically but psychologically. Those who received the food, medicine, or letters felt a spark of hope, a reminder that the outside world had not forgotten them. In the harshest conditions, small acts of kindness became revolutionary. As the ghettos grew more oppressive, the need for organized resistance became clear. The Nazis' deportation campaigns in 1942, particularly from the Warsaw Ghetto, forced Jewish communities to confront the terrifying reality that many were being sent to death camps like Treblinka. In response, underground organizations emerged. The Jewish Combat Organization, known by its Polish initials ZOB, and the Jewish Military Union, ZZW, were formed. These groups were composed of men and women willing to risk everything to fight back. They smuggled weapons, gathered intelligence, and trained in secret, often with improvised tools and limited ammunition. Theirs was not a conventional army, theirs was a force born of desperation, courage, and a refusal to vanish quietly. Resistance took many other forms beyond armed struggle. Cultural and spiritual defiance was equally powerful. In secret rooms, musicians played forbidden compositions, writers recorded diaries, and religious leaders held prayer services that were technically illegal. People memorized poetry, history, and sacred texts, ensuring that knowledge would survive even if the community was destroyed. Each act was a reminder that identity and memory could not be erased. Children were taught songs, stories, and lessons that defied the message of the occupiers, that they were expendable. In these small acts, the ghettos themselves became arenas of psychological resistance, spaces where the human mind could assert its freedom even when the body was trapped. The networks that formed were surprisingly sophisticated. Couriers ran messages from one ghetto to another, coordinated by secret codes and signals. Some workers in German-controlled offices secretly provided information about deportation schedules, enabling others to hide or escape. Groups documented atrocities, ensuring that the world would know the truth even if the Nazis tried to destroy evidence. The effort was monumental, hundreds, sometimes thousands, of individuals working in coordination, using creativity and courage to resist a system that had been designed to crush them. Every successful communication or smuggling operation was a small victory, proof that the human spirit could adapt, organize, and fight even in the darkest times. In addition to cultural and logistical resistance, acts of sabotage began to appear. Factories in which Jews were forced to work were often the targets of subtle forms of defiance. Machines were tampered with, materials were wasted, and production slowed intentionally. Every minor disruption was an act of rebellion against the machinery of Nazi power. These efforts required ingenuity and nerve, as detection could lead to execution. Still, prisoners found ways to slow down the war effort without losing hope, proving that resistance was not always about weapons, it was about cleverness, endurance, and courage. The seeds of armed rebellion were planted in these early acts. As deportations intensified and the grim reality of extermination became undeniable, preparation for armed resistance began in earnest. Young fighters smuggled pistols, grenades, and ammunition into the ghettos, often risking death for every step. Meetings were held in hidden rooms, basements, and attics. Plans were drawn, training was conducted in secrecy, and strategies were debated. There was no illusion of conventional victory, the goal was survival, delay, and the assertion of dignity against an enemy that sought to destroy them. For many, the fight itself, regardless of outcome, was a declaration of humanity. Even children and the elderly found ways to contribute. Teenagers ran messages, guided hidden escapees, or carried small but vital supplies. Older residents offered wisdom, experience, and moral support, reminding everyone why resistance mattered. Every role, no matter how minor it seemed, became critical in a society under siege. The ghettos were not just prisons, they were laboratories of human courage, resilience, and ingenuity. Here, the oppressed found ways to assert control, even if only in small increments, and to defy a regime that demanded total obedience. By the end of 1942, these efforts coalesced into a powerful, if tragic, reality. Organized Jewish resistance existed in almost every major ghetto. It was diverse, ranging from cultural preservation to armed struggle, from smuggling food to sabotaging factories. It was dangerous, often deadly, but it proved a fundamental truth: even when the world seems bent on erasing a people, courage and solidarity can flourish. Resistance was not just survival, it was a statement that life mattered, that identity mattered, and that even in the shadow of death, hope could endure. The story of Jewish resistance in the ghettos reminds us that history is not only written by the victors or the oppressors. In cellars, attics, and hidden rooms, ordinary people became heroes, their courage leaving a legacy that could never be extinguished. It was a warning to those who would claim absolute power, and it was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. In the darkness of occupation, the oppressed refused to remain silent. They fought with what they had, held onto what they could, and in doing so, laid the foundation for some of the most remarkable acts of defiance in the history of humanity. The city of Warsaw had become a living tomb long before the uprising began, a maze of narrow streets and crumbling buildings packed with people who had been stripped of freedom, property, and dignity. By 1942, the Nazis had completed the first stages of deportation, sending tens of thousands of Jews from the ghetto to the gas chambers at Treblinka. Hunger and disease were constant companions, yet in the midst of unimaginable suffering, a spark of resistance began to glow. It started as whispers among young men and women who refused to accept the inevitability of death, a quiet determination that would soon ignite into one of the most extraordinary rebellions of the Second World War. They did not have tanks, artillery, or trained armies. What they had was courage, ingenuity, and an unshakable refusal to be erased from history. The Warsaw Ghetto, overcrowded beyond reason, was a place where survival required ingenuity at every turn. Families shared single rooms, scavenged for scraps of food, and found ways to navigate the brutal Nazi bureaucracy that controlled their lives. In this claustrophobic environment, secret organizations emerged, forged by desperation and the need to fight back. Two of the most notable groups were the Jewish Combat Organization, ZOB, and the Jewish Military Union, ZZW, each composed of young fighters who were determined to resist deportation and protect the remnants of their community. They began training in basements, attics, and cellars, learning to handle pistols, grenades, and homemade weapons. Every whispered instruction, every concealed cache of explosives, was an act of rebellion against the machinery that sought to destroy them. By early 1943, rumors spread through the ghetto that the Nazis planned a final liquidation. The residents had already endured round after round of deportations, each more terrifying than the last, and the threat of mass extermination loomed larger than ever. The fighters intensified their preparations. They established hidden bunkers and secret escape routes, stockpiled weapons wherever they could, and recruited anyone willing to take part in the defense. Even those too young or weak to fight played critical roles. Messengers, lookouts, and couriers carried information through the streets under the constant threat of discovery. The community had become an intricate web of resistance, with every act, no matter how small, contributing to the larger effort. The uprising itself began on April 19, 1943, when German troops entered the ghetto, expecting compliance. They were met instead with armed defiance. Fighters had positioned themselves strategically in buildings, basements, and narrow alleys, ready to ambush the enemy. The resistance was improvised but fierce, pistols fired from hidden windows, Molotov cocktails hurled from rooftops, barricades erected in the streets to slow the advance. For several days, the Nazis, trained and equipped for conventional warfare, found themselves facing a determination that could not be crushed by superior firepower alone. The ghetto became a battlefield unlike any other in Europe, where courage, knowledge of the terrain, and desperation gave the defenders a brief but symbolic advantage. The fighting was brutal and relentless. German troops, frustrated by the unexpected resistance, responded with overwhelming force. They set buildings on fire, used flamethrowers, and bombarded barricades with artillery. Yet despite the extreme danger, the Jewish fighters refused to surrender. They moved through hidden tunnels, emerged from basements to surprise enemy patrols, and vanished into the labyrinthine streets before reinforcements could trap them. The defenders were vastly outnumbered and under-equipped, but their knowledge of the ghetto and their willingness to sacrifice everything created moments of significant disruption. Each street held a story of heroism, each building a testament to the human spirit's refusal to yield. Women played essential roles in the uprising, challenging the stereotype of passive victims. They carried ammunition, transported the wounded, and guided fighters through secret passages. Some disguised themselves as civilians to gather intelligence, while others worked to protect the most vulnerable, including children who could not fight. Their contributions were often invisible to history for decades, yet without their courage, many operations would have failed. Every action, no matter how small, was a thread in the larger fabric of resistance that made the uprising possible. Despite their bravery, the odds were impossible. The Nazis gradually regained control street by street, building by building. They burned homes, leveled barricades, and executed anyone captured. By May 16, 1943, the organized resistance had been crushed. Most fighters were dead, and thousands of civilians were deported to extermination camps. Yet the uprising's significance cannot be measured in casualties alone. It represented the first large-scale, armed Jewish revolt in occupied Europe, a declaration that defiance was possible even under the most harrowing circumstances. The fighters' courage reverberated far beyond the walls of Warsaw, inspiring other resistance movements across Europe. The psychological impact of the uprising was profound. For the world outside the ghetto, news of armed Jewish resistance shattered stereotypes and propaganda that had depicted Jews as passive victims. For survivors and witnesses, the uprising became a symbol of human dignity and courage, proving that even when faced with annihilation, people could fight, organize, and assert their humanity. Stories of individuals who held out against impossible odds circulated quickly, preserving the memory of heroism for future generations. The names of fighters and their deeds became legends, reminding the world that defiance is possible even in the shadow of death. Even in defeat, the legacy of the uprising lived on. The bravery demonstrated in Warsaw inspired Jewish partisans in forests and remote regions, encouraging others to escape ghettos and join guerrilla forces. It influenced clandestine operations in other ghettos, where similar resistance movements began to form, learning from the example of Warsaw. The uprising also shaped post-war memory, becoming a central narrative in Holocaust education, literature, and film. It was more than a battle, it was a statement that oppression cannot extinguish the desire for freedom and justice. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising also highlighted the ethical complexity of resistance. Fighters faced impossible choices, deciding between immediate survival and long-term defiance. They had to balance the lives of civilians with the urgency of armed struggle, knowing that their actions could provoke brutal reprisals. Every decision carried consequences, yet these choices demonstrated profound moral courage. Resistance, in this context, was not simply a tactical endeavor, it was an assertion of moral agency, a refusal to accept the moral erasure the Nazis sought to impose. In retrospect, the uprising serves as a reminder of the indomitable human spirit. It teaches that resistance can take many forms: armed combat, smuggling, intelligence gathering, and even the simple act of refusing to obey unjust orders. The story of Warsaw is not only one of tragedy but also one of inspiration, showing that dignity and courage can persist even in the most extreme circumstances. The fighters may have fallen, but their legacy continues to educate and inspire, proving that even in history's darkest moments, people can illuminate the path with their bravery. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising stands as a historical testament to resilience and defiance. It reveals the extraordinary lengths ordinary people can go to preserve life, identity, and hope when faced with systematic destruction. In the narrow streets of the ghetto, in the secret bunkers and hidden rooms, Jews fought not only for survival but for recognition of their humanity. And although the uprising was ultimately crushed by overwhelming force, its memory endures, a symbol of courage, unity, and the enduring power of resistance against tyranny. As the ghettos fell one by one and the deportations emptied streets and homes, a new form of resistance emerged beyond the city walls among the forests, marshes, and remote villages of Eastern Europe. Those who had survived the ghettos or escaped transport trains became the seeds of partisan movements, determined to fight the Nazi regime while protecting those who had nowhere else to turn. Life as a partisan was brutal, a constant battle against hunger, disease, exposure, and the relentless pursuit of German patrols. Yet, for many, the forests offered freedom, however fragile, and the chance to assert control over a world that had tried to strip them of humanity. The transformation from civilian to guerrilla fighter required courage and ingenuity. Escapees often traveled at night, guided by the stars or by trusted locals who risked their own lives to help them. They crossed rivers, hid in abandoned barns, and avoided roads where German soldiers or collaborators might spot them. Once in the forest, they quickly had to learn survival skills, building shelters, foraging for food, identifying edible plants, and protecting themselves against harsh weather. Every day was a struggle, but each small success strengthened the bonds between fighters and deepened their commitment to the resistance. Partisan units varied widely in size, structure, and purpose. Some were small, tightly knit groups of friends or family members who had escaped together, while others were larger, organized formations with hierarchies, codes, and strict discipline. The Bielski partisans in Belarus became one of the most famous examples, a group that not only engaged in sabotage against German forces but also provided refuge for more than 1,200 Jews, including women, children, and the elderly. Their strategy balanced armed resistance with humanitarian protection, ensuring that survival and defiance went hand in hand. Each unit developed its own methods, adapting to local terrain, enemy movements, and the constant threat of betrayal. The activities of partisans were both daring and methodical. They sabotaged railways, bridges, and supply depots, slowing the Nazi war machine while sending a message of defiance. Ambushes against patrols, often at great personal risk, disrupted enemy operations and protected villages that harbored other escapees. Intelligence gathering became critical. Partisans observed troop movements, reported on weapon stockpiles, and passed information to Allied forces whenever possible. Even small acts, like destroying a communications line or burning a supply depot, were vital contributions to the broader resistance effort, proving that guerrilla warfare did not require large armies, only strategy, courage, and determination. Women played indispensable roles within partisan groups. They cooked, cleaned, and cared for the sick and wounded, but they also participated in combat, scouting, and intelligence missions. Some acted as couriers, carrying critical messages across dangerous territory. Others helped forge documents or smuggle supplies. Their work, often invisible in historical records, was essential to the survival and effectiveness of the units. Without their contributions, the operational success of many partisan brigades would have been severely limited. In every case, women were both protectors and fighters, blending courage with practicality in a world that demanded both. Life in the partisan camps was never easy. Food was scarce, weapons were limited, and the threat of discovery was constant. Many suffered from frostbite, malnutrition, and illness. Discipline was strict, as any lapse could mean death for the entire group. Yet, amid the hardship, a sense of community flourished. Shared stories, songs, prayers, and the simple acts of kindness like giving the last portion of food to a child kept morale alive. These moments of humanity were as vital as any ambush or sabotage mission. They reminded partisans why they fought, not only for revenge or survival but for the preservation of dignity, identity, and the lives of those who could not fight for themselves. The challenges faced by partisan fighters were immense. German forces, often supported by local collaborators, launched regular sweeps through forests and villages, burning homes and executing suspected sympathizers. Informers and spies lurked everywhere, meaning that trust had to be hard-won and constantly tested. Every decision carried weight. A wrong move could expose the entire group to annihilation. Despite these dangers, partisans maintained discipline and courage, using camouflage, secret codes, and careful reconnaissance to stay one step ahead. Their adaptability was extraordinary, and their ability to turn the most ordinary elements of the environment into defensive tools underscored the ingenuity that survival demanded. Partisan operations were not solely military, they were deeply human endeavors. Units often integrated refugees, provided education for children, and preserved cultural and religious practices that the Nazis had sought to destroy. They created makeshift schools, held religious ceremonies, and even maintained small libraries of salvaged books. These efforts were more than morale boosting, they were acts of cultural resistance, proving that even in hiding, identity and memory could be preserved. The forests became not only sites of struggle but of community, where life was protected as fiercely as it was fought for. Among the most notable achievements of partisan groups were those that successfully disrupted German operations while saving lives. Bridges were blown, convoys ambushed, and German communication lines cut, slowing troop movements and diverting resources. Each act of sabotage demonstrated the ability of a small, determined group to impact a larger war machine. Yet, equally significant were the thousands of lives saved through the provision of shelter, medical care, and guidance to those escaping ghettos and death marches. The Bielski partisans, for example, embodied this dual mission, resistance through action and protection through compassion. They became living proof that fighting and saving could coexist, and that heroism often requires both courage and conscience. As the war progressed, partisan units became increasingly coordinated with other resistance movements and even Allied operations. Information collected in forests was passed to Soviet, Polish, and other partisan units, influencing broader strategies against German forces. These alliances were fraught with difficulty, as trust was always tentative, but they increased the effectiveness of resistance efforts. Fighters learned to navigate not only the dangers of the enemy but also the complex politics of occupied territories, balancing alliances, objectives, and survival in a constantly shifting landscape. The legacy of partisan fighters extends far beyond the immediate impact on German military operations. Their actions demonstrated that resistance was possible even under conditions of extreme oppression. They protected the most vulnerable, disrupted enemy logistics, and created a historical record of courage and ingenuity. Their stories challenge assumptions about passivity and victimhood, proving that human agency can endure even in the harshest conditions. By risking everything, they ensured that the memory of resistance would survive, leaving lessons for future generations about bravery, solidarity, and the ethical imperative to fight oppression. The partisan struggle exemplifies a broader truth about human resilience: when survival is threatened, creativity, courage, and community become tools of resistance. These fighters, operating from forests and hidden camps, were more than guerrillas, they were custodians of life, culture, and hope. Each mission, each act of defiance, was a declaration that oppression could not completely destroy identity, and that even in the harshest exile, humanity could flourish. Their courage became a bridge between the horrors of ghetto life and the liberation that eventually came, a living testament to the strength of those who refused to be erased. The guns fell silent, the forests emptied, and the ghettos were no longer filled with the constant hum of fear and resistance. Yet the echoes of the Jewish struggle during World War II did not vanish with the end of the conflict. Liberation brought relief, but it also revealed the immense scale of loss and devastation. Survivors emerged from forests, bunkers, and hiding places to find homes destroyed, families decimated, and entire communities erased. They carried the physical scars of malnutrition, illness, and injury, but even heavier were the psychological scars, memories of betrayal, the haunting knowledge of who had been left behind, and the burden of survival itself. Yet in the midst of grief, a determination emerged, a commitment to ensure that their story, their resistance, and the lives of those who had perished would not be forgotten. One of the most pressing challenges for survivors was rebuilding a sense of community in a landscape that had been violently transformed. Entire neighborhoods were gone, and borders had shifted in the aftermath of war. Refugees gathered in displaced persons camps, shared resources, and created makeshift schools and social structures to restore some semblance of normal life. In these fragile spaces, former fighters recounted their experiences, not only to document history but to help the next generation understand the cost of oppression and the power of resistance. Oral testimonies, letters, and diaries became vital tools for preserving memory, ensuring that what had been endured and resisted would not disappear into silence. Legal reckoning followed as the world sought to hold perpetrators accountable. Trials, such as the Nuremberg trials, examined evidence of mass deportations, extermination, and forced labor, placing Nazi leaders and collaborators on the stand. Survivors' testimonies were critical, detailing not just atrocities but the organized resistance that challenged the notion of helpless victimhood. Many camp commanders and officials were convicted, yet others escaped justice, leaving painful ambiguities. The process highlighted the complexity of post-war morality, how to balance punishment with reconciliation, accountability with rebuilding, and memory with the human need to move forward. For the survivors, justice was never complete, but the acknowledgement of their suffering and courage became a cornerstone of historical truth. Education became a central aspect of memorializing resistance. Holocaust memorials, museums, and educational programs were established across Europe, Israel, and the United States. Students learned not only about the horrors of the Holocaust but also about the acts of defiance that punctuated the period. The stories of young fighters in the Warsaw Ghetto, women who carried supplies through forests, and partisans who risked everything to protect children became integral parts of curricula. By emphasizing resistance alongside tragedy, educators sought to convey a more nuanced understanding of history, that humanity can endure even amid unspeakable cruelty, and that courage takes many forms. Cultural preservation remained an enduring legacy. Writers, poets, and filmmakers chronicled the experiences of Jews who resisted, ensuring that their voices reached broader audiences. Literature captured the daily life in ghettos, the intensity of armed rebellion, and the ingenuity of partisans in remote forests. Films recreated battles, escapes, and acts of defiance, giving visual testimony to events that many feared would be lost. Artistic endeavors also provided catharsis for survivors, a means of processing trauma while honoring the memory of the fallen. Music, theater, and storytelling became tools to maintain identity, bridging generations with a shared understanding of resilience. The moral and ethical lessons of resistance are profound. The fighters, whether in urban ghettos or forest encampments, demonstrated that defiance can coexist with compassion. Acts of resistance were not solely about fighting an enemy but about preserving life, protecting the vulnerable, and asserting humanity. The Bielski partisans, for instance, saved more than 1,000 lives while simultaneously sabotaging enemy operations, illustrating that courage and ethical responsibility can operate hand in hand even under extreme conditions. This duality challenges simplistic narratives of war and oppression, revealing the complexity of human decision-making in life and death situations. The legacy of Jewish resistance also reshaped collective memory and identity. For Jews worldwide, the stories of uprisings, guerrilla fighters, and underground networks became symbols of resilience and pride. Communities honored fighters through memorials, ceremonies, and the preservation of artifacts, such as weapons, diaries, and photographs. Names of individuals who had risked and often lost their lives were etched into monuments, ensuring that future generations would know of their courage. These acts of remembrance emphasized that survival alone was not the only measure of heroism. The choice to resist, to fight back even when chances seemed impossible, was equally vital. Resistance influenced post-war societies in broader ways, offering lessons on civic duty, human rights, and moral courage. Survivors carried their experiences into new countries, contributing to rebuilding efforts and political movements. They became educators, historians, and activists, advocating against injustice wherever they found it. Their voices reminded the world that the atrocities of the past required vigilance in the present and that ordinary individuals could confront oppression in meaningful ways. The legacy of the Jewish fighters transcended national and ethnic boundaries, offering universal insights into resilience, solidarity, and ethical responsibility. Finally, the enduring power of memory serves as both warning and inspiration. Monuments to resistance and survival, such as the memorials at Warsaw, Treblinka, and Bielski encampments, are more than historical markers. They are reminders of the stakes of tyranny and the courage required to oppose it. Annual commemorations, survivor testimonies, and educational initiatives ensure that the stories of resistance continue to resonate. The lessons are clear: even in the darkest circumstances, individuals and communities can assert agency, protect others, and preserve humanity. In remembering resistance, the world affirms that courage and dignity are enduring human values. The story of Jewish resistance, from secret schools and underground networks to uprisings and partisan warfare, concludes not with the end of the war but with the ongoing struggle to remember, honor, and learn. Liberation may have ended the immediate threat of annihilation, but it also revealed the depth of what had been lost and the magnitude of what had been gained through courage. Survivors rebuilt lives, recounted experiences, and established memorials, transforming their pain into lessons for the world. The legacy of resistance is thus living, dynamic, and universal, a testament to the power of human agency, the resilience of culture, and the eternal importance of asserting life against forces that seek to destroy it.